Here goes part two of the opening statements. This here is going to be the defense's opening statement. And here is where the defense talks about this had nothing to do with Chris and how Melissa's mom, Norma Patton, is involved in all of this, how she helped, well, not all of this, but how she helped Carl, the father, commit taking people's lives, helping cover it up, and how it was similar to what happened to Melissa.
Did suffer a tragic death. And you haven't yet heard the extent of which she had suffered a tragic life. But the extent of her suffering in life and in death had nothing to do with Christopher Wolfenbarger. The state's story begins correctly. This is a case about a horrifying discovery of human remains that later became identified as Melissa Wolfenbarger's. But the evidence will show you over the next few days that the state's story has gaping holes in it. And that the state is going to ask you effectively to imagine in order to connect the dots between those over those gaping holes. To fill the gaps, if you will. What the state is declining to tell you in this case is far more important than what they have told you. And your job over the next few days is going to be to see those gaps, to refuse to imagine, and to demand proof of all the elements of the crime that is charged beyond a reasonable doubt. You're going to hear evidence, some of it from their own witnesses, that multiple other individuals could have had something to do with Melissa's death, starting with her own parents. You've heard mention already of the Flint River murders. Melissa's father, Carl Patton, committed a string of murders in the late 1970s. He was suspected of those murders for a long time. He was investigated, but they were not prosecuted and proved until 2003, 4 years after Melissa's disappearance and death. You'll be presented with evidence that Norma Patton, his wife, helped him directly commit at least 2 of those murders, to dispose of the bodies, to clean up the crime scenes, and to wrap up the bodies and dispose of them in ways that are somewhat similar to the way Melissa's remains were found. Carl, Melissa's father, died in prison last December. Melissa's father eventually confessed to killing 5 people. Some of those were for personal revenge. Some of those were contract killings for money. And at least 2 of those were murders of his own friends because they knew too much. All of the victims were either close friends or family members.
Crazy, right? Her own father and mother were involved in stuff like that. The defense goes on to explain that Melissa's mom was a co-defendant in 2 of the cases involving the dad, and she got immunity if she testified against Carl.
Thank you.
Satisfactory.
Yes, sir.
Melissa's mother in 2 of those murders was a co-defendant. She confessed to planning 2 cold-blooded murders, cleaning up the blood leaching the floor, etc. And the murders from which the name that comes to those murders is the Flint River murders, is because one of those bodies was dumped in the Flint River, the other in the Altamont River. And the only reason Norma didn't go to prison like Carl did was because she got immunity to testify against him. And she'll be here to testify this week. The evidence will show that there is also a Patton family associate who also had very strong motives to kill Melissa. For trying to get him prosecuted for allegedly molesting her in the 90s, and also because his father later turned out, to his knowledge, was one of Carl's victims. And until he learned that, he was a family friend and hung out with the family. And that man's name is Eric Martin Jackson. You'll find out later that at some point Martin learned what Melissa's father had done to his father. And he goes and buys a series of burial plots at a cemetery in 1997, a year before Melissa goes missing, or maybe a year and a half. And he buys them in the very cemetery that Melissa is buried in today. And later, because later he sold those plots to her family.
The defense attorney is going to call out the fact that Norma is going to get on the stand and try to act like her and Melissa had this really close bond. They were loving and all the good stuff, right? But there's neighbors and childhood friends of Melissa who will go completely against that will be testifying at this trial.
The evidence is going to show that Melissa was actually abused by her mother in her own home for many years and started running away frequently. Her mother locked her in a room all day, every day, from roughly ages 7 to 12. The evidence will show that their home was so foul and dirty that Melissa acquired a foul smell in her clothes and hair that made the other kids at school bully her and tease her. You'll hear evidence from Melissa's next-door neighbor and childhood friend that she will detail the abuse that she endured in that house. Moreover, at some point before Melissa ran away, her sister Tina had a pregnancy in that house, delivered the baby in the house secretly, and tried to dispose of it secretly in a clothes hamper in the house. 13-year-old Melissa discovered that baby's corpse. She eventually told school officials, who later called the police, and it was at that point that Melissa began running away from her home regularly. Christopher, in fact, first met Melissa because she ran away from home. And through a mutual friend, they met at that mutual friend's house.
Next, the defense attorney will bring up the incident from July of 1998 where Christopher is accused of hitting her and leaving marks on her and all of that stuff. So listen to what he has to say about it.
Moved up to Brookline in 1998. The children did not go with it. Now, you've heard some talk about an incident that happened in July of 1998 when Melissa took out charges against Christopher. You also heard the state tell you that Melissa came back and dropped the request for that protective order. What they didn't tell you is the very next day, Melissa calls Kathy Wolfenbarger from the Henry County Superior Court and asks her to please come down and sign the papers to make her custody of those children permanent. To make Kathy's custody of Melissa's children permanent. And Melissa permanently relinquishes her parental rights to those children. One of the reasons Melissa originally gave for giving her children over to Kathy Wolfenbarger, and she tells this to Kathy, and she tells this also to Christopher's sister independently, was that she did not want her parents to have anything to do with her children because they are bad people. After relinquishing her parental rights, Melissa quit working around that time at the Waffle House in East Point with her sister, and for some reason begins randomly working at a Waffle House clear up in Doraville. No one knows why she went up there. According to everyone, no one had any connections up there, friends or family or anything. But she goes up there and starts working. Melissa started spending more and more time in Doraville, days at a time, working double shifts, spending the night at someone's house, and then multiple days, and days turned into weeks, she would be gone from Christopher's house. And it was at that time that she had started seeing Thomas Michael Dixon, the state mentioned a while ago. We'll have a chance to cross-examine him. In October of that year, Melissa got arrested in Gwinnett County for violating her probation, and she spent 30 days in jail until early November. The terms of her probation required her to do community service. This was outstanding from 1997, still in effect. She was to do community service, she was to take GED classes, and she was to report regularly to her probation officer, and she had not done any of that. And so they arrested her, gave her 30 days in jail, and then released her back on the same terms of probation. Within 1 month, she is already violating her probation again. Although she was not rearrested at that time. So at this point in her life, Melissa was spending as much, if not more, time in Doraville as she was at Christopher's house. She only occasionally came back to see Christopher. She had her own job. She had her own money. She had her own circle of friends. She had her own freedom. She had no obligations to her children. And so when in December of 1998, she did not come home for several weeks or months, Christopher could safely assume she had decided to live her own life on her own terms, wherever she decided to live. Moreover, if Christopher had raised a stink about it at the time, Melissa was in violation of her probation. She would have been arrested.
See, he explains away how or why some of the stuff happened the way that it did. And there is some sketchy stuff going on with her family. That's what I do know.
Things in this case, as you heard, were found on Avon Avenue. It's an industrial area near the west end of Atlanta. The evidence will show that it just so happens Melissa's father, Carl Patton, was familiar with this area. He grew up in a childhood home on Main Street in College Park. It's just a few miles down the road. Further, the evidence will show that Norma and Carl actually went up to Brookline Street right after her birthday in February of 1999. They found Christopher's empty house at that time. They learned from a neighbor that Christopher had moved out sometime between Christmas and New Year's. They also learned that from that neighbor that Christopher worked at Action Glass down on Avon Avenue. So they drove down to Avon Avenue and talked to the people at Action Glass. And they learned that he had been let go there. Again, this is February 1999. Carl and Norma Patton knew where Chris worked and where he lived months before the head was found on Avon Avenue, right beside where he worked. The state is correct that Melissa's mother and sister are going to testify against Christopher. They're going to blame him. They're going to call him a domestic abuser. But there's a lot of context you don't know. Keep in mind, as we've already said, the evidence is going to show that Melissa only met Christopher when she ran away from home. The evidence is also going to show you that Norma Patton has consistently, out of her own mouth, stated that she absolutely hates Christopher. From the very first time she ever saw him, she hated him. She worked and did everything in her power possible to prevent Christopher from seeing Melissa. When he was 16, would not let them date, or tried to prevent them from dating. Tried to prevent Melissa from leaving the house. Tried to prevent them from getting married. She tried to force Melissa onto birth control so that she could not get pregnant. Melissa's older sister joined that opposition to Christopher as well. You'll hear it admitted from her own mouth that she did not like Christopher. No one in her family liked Christopher. And that she tried everything she could, perpetually, to intervene in Christopher and Melissa's marriage to get Melissa to leave Chris. The evidence is going to show that any claims of abuse or bruises on Christopher's part only began to be generated after Melissa started working with Tina at Waffle House. And the evidence of claims of abuse only come from witnesses who came under the influence of Norma and Tina. Christopher and Melissa, as I said, had 2 children, Chrissy and Joey. Chrissy was born in August of 1995, Joey 11 months later. Again, the state is going to present testimony from Norma and Tina, who will say that Melissa would never, under any circumstances, have abandoned her children. She would not have just left and never kept contact with her children. Impossible.
And the reason that's impossible is because the prosecution paints him as a very close family and she loved her kids and whatever, but she gave up her rights to Christopher's mom. That's why it's not impossible that she left and left the kids behind. She had already done that. Okay, now he's going to cover about Christina, which he refers to as Christy. She tries to say that Christopher got rid of all of Melissa's belongings, but Christy did not live there.
You'll hear testimony from Christopher and Melissa's own daughter, who's now grown up, of course. Her name is Christina. Some call her Chrissy. She will testify as a state's witness. She will say that she remembers to the day when her mother disappeared and all the pictures and belongings were removed from the house. Again, the evidence will show that she didn't live in that house. She lived in Stockbridge. The evidence will show you that at that time, Chrissy was every bit of 3 years old. Moreover, Christopher and Melissa's children didn't live in that house, as I said. Chrissy will also tell you that years later, she remembers Christopher making these offhand comments about he knows how to get away with murder, and the key is to hide the body, or to put it under the foundation of a house that's getting built, so they'll concrete over it and no one will ever find it. And there are various versions of that story. Christopher's son, Joey, who's also now grown up, will also testify, and he will say he was in the room when such comments were made. And that Christopher was speaking in the context of the boasts that Carl Patton used to make, who was a nut girl.
So it wasn't Christopher specifically saying that he would know how to hide a body or whatever. He was speaking in the context of Carl, which is Melissa's dad, because he had worked with him prior.
We'll have evidence in this trial that early in their relationship, Carl hired Christopher to help him in the roofing business. Chris spent time around Carl and heard him say these things. Even Chrissy will admit that when Christopher made such comments, it was contextual within a discussion and had nothing to do with Melissa whatsoever. Chrissy will also admit that everything she knows about the case, she learned from Norma Patton.
The defense will go on to discuss the gaps in the state's case, and this portion of his opening statement is probably the most telling, is what I'm going to say when it comes to the evidence, because there is a huge lack of evidence. What was found on Melissa and what does not match Christopher?
The state will not present any evidence of a cause of death. The state will not present any evidence of a murder weapon. The evidence obviously will show that there were remains that were discovered and that there were marks on the bones. But those wounds are all post-mortem. The state will present you with no evidence of how she died. The state will present no evidence of when she died or where she died. The state will present you with no evidence of where she was dismembered or when or how she was dismembered. They won't present any evidence of how she was transported to the site in the condition that she was. The state will provide claims about a saw that went missing from Christopher's work, allegedly around the time that Christopher was there. No evidence will show, even though the state claims otherwise, that he stole a saw from them, or that he was terminated for that reason. Furthermore, there's no proof that the kind of tool that actually made the marks on these bones was a saw. If so, what kind of saw? We have no evidence of what type of saw it would have been. We've got no evidence that will show that markings are distinctive of this reciprocating saw that was taken versus the circular saw he mentioned when he started his story. Furthermore, your common sense will tell you that there are about a literal million saws in the state of Georgia. Anybody can access a saw. Anyone can access a wide variety of types of saws. You'll hear from investigators from the APD. They will admit that once Melissa's remains were identified, They searched Christopher and Melissa's house on Brookline Street. They searched every inch of the home, inside, outside, every room, basement. They sprayed the entire house with a reactive agent that discovers drops of blood. Not a single drop was found. They took paint samples from every room. Why? Because when Melissa's head was examined, there were chips of paint in her hair. There were synthetic fibers in her hair. And forensic evidence will show that. The fibers were, in fact, found to be consistent with some kind of a bath mat or even a carpet. Very broad category. When Melissa's remains were the paint samples of her remains did not match any of the paint samples from Christopher's house. There was no match of any fiber from Christopher's house. A pubic hair was found on Melissa's remains. Christopher willingly submitted his pubic hair samples. They didn't match. Head hair samples were found. Christopher submitted head hair samples. The head hair samples didn't match. The medical examiners in this case made DNA analysis of the head almost impossible because one of the medical examiners or anthropologists soaked it in bleach. But the technology still won out in the end. The plastic bags in which the remains have been kept were recently re-examined using the most powerful DNA testing available in modern times, detecting trace amounts of DNA. And sure enough, one of those bags returned a profile that was viable for testing against subjects. It said there were at least 5 human contributors touching this bag. 2 of them were male. Christopher submitted his DNA. It didn't match.
Did you hear? All of that evidence that does not match Christopher at all. And those were on her at the time that she was found. This next little piece is actually pretty interesting because the state says Christopher was the last one to see Melissa alive. Listen to what the defense says.
And we will ask you when trial is over to reject that level of fake expert testimony. Another thing, the state's going to offer evidence to say Christopher was the last person to see Melissa alive in December of 1998. You've already heard it. But other evidence is going to show that Melissa's sister, Tina, actually saw her the following spring. At that time, Christopher had already long moved out of the area. Although Carl Patton was serving 5 life sentences in prison throughout this whole period up until he died last December, that did not stop Norma Patton from firmly expecting he would be paroled at some point. And she began looking into his parole within about 12 years after his life sentence had been served, his first of 4 or 5. And the law technically at the time allowed for someone serving a life sentence to be eligible for parole after 14 years of service in prison. The evidence is going to show you that Norma operated on the belief that the only reason Carl had not been paroled was because his son-in-law, Christopher, had not yet been arrested. She will state explicitly out of her own mouth in a police interview that she believed that as soon as Christopher would be locked up, her husband would be released to come home. And she worked tirelessly for years with the DAs, with the police, and with media campaigns to make sure that happened. Ironically, the evidence will show that the investigators spent hardly any time at all investigating these other potential suspects. No hair samples were taken from them, no DNA samples were taken from them, no pubic hair samples, no searches of their homes, no paint chip samples taken from their houses. No one took DNA samples for this reason from the sister or the accused molester in her home or the friend down the road, or anyone else. The evidence will show at most that Melissa somehow died and that someone tried to dispose of parts of her body. The evidence will show that everything beyond that is speculation and imagination. The evidence, as I said, won't show you a cause of death, a weapon, an instrument of death, an incident that led to her death, who dismembered or transported or scattered her remains. There will not be proof beyond a reasonable doubt in this case. There's no DNA, there's no high-powered technology, there's no expert testimony, there's no fiber evidence, no surveillance, no snitches, no co-conspirators, no confession, no eyewitnesses. The evidence will show that the state expects you to fill in all those missing gaps with your imagination. There is no evidence of these charges in this case, and that's why we will ask you at the end of this case to return a verdict of not guilty.
And that's it. That is the defense's opening. This is going to be an interesting trial once all the evidence actually starts to come out, because if the defense's story is true, where's the proof that Christopher took the life of Melissa? Especially when the evidence might point to her own family. Tell me what you guys think.